Steam rose from David Martinez's cheap instant noodles as he watched the endless stream of beings flow through the Central Hub's main corridor, each more exotic than the last. Three-eyed merchants from Proxima bargained loudly with tentacled traders, while scaled diplomats glided past on hover platforms, their robes trailing behind them like liquid metal. David had been working at this interspecies trade station for 6 months now, translating documents and contracts between dozens of alien languages, yet the sight still amazed him. His small desk sat wedged between a Centaurian bank and a vegan spice shop, close enough to smell the strange aromatics but far enough that he couldn't afford anything they sold. Today had been particularly rough. 3 clients had rejected his translation work, claiming his interpretations of their cultural nuances were too simplistic. The rejection stung, not just because of the lost income, but because David genuinely cared about bridging the gap between species through language. He pushed the criticism aside and slurped his noodles, watching a group of crystalline beings conduct what appeared to be a singing negotiation. That's when he noticed her. She sat alone at one of the metal tables outside Brew Station, the hub's only coffee shop, staring into an empty cup with an expression of profound sadness even from a distance. David could tell she was different from the usual alien visitors. Her skin had an almost luminescent quality, shifting between silver and pale blue depending on how the artificial light hit her. She was tall and elegant, with long limbs and graceful movements, but what caught David's attention most were her eyes, large and violet, holding a depth of intelligence that seemed to peer right through the chaos around her. Other patrons gave her table a wide berth, some staring with obvious curiosity, others with poorly concealed suspicion. David recognized the look on their faces. It was the same expression humans wore when they encountered something they didn't understand but assumed was dangerous. The woman seemed oblivious to the attention, lost in her own thoughts as she traced the rim of her empty cup with one long finger. David found himself standing up before he'd consciously decided to move. He grabbed his jacket and walked toward the coffee shop, his heart beating faster with each step as he got closer. He could see that her skin wasn't just luminescent but covered in intricate patterns that looked almost like circuitry, pulsing faintly with bioluminescent light. Her hair fell in waves down, her back changing color from deep purple to midnight blue as she moved. When David reached her table, she looked up with those remarkable violet eyes and he felt his prepared speech evaporate. "Excuse me," he managed to say, his voice coming out rougher than intended. "I noticed your cup is empty." She tilted her head slightly, a gesture that seemed both alien and familiar at the same time. "Would you like me to get you another drink?" David continued, pulling his credit chip from his pocket, despite knowing it contained barely enough for his own dinner. For a long moment, she simply stared at him, and David wondered if she understood Standard Galactic, or if he'd need to switch to one of the other languages he knew. Then she smiled, and the expression transformed her entire face. "That is very kind of you," she said, her voice carrying an accent he couldn't place but found oddly musical. "I am Lyra." "David," he replied, extending his hand in the human gesture of greeting, looked at his outstretched palm for a moment, then carefully placed her own hand in his. Her skin was warm and had a subtle vibration to it, like holding a tuning fork. "What would you like?" David asked, nodding toward the coffee shop menu displayed in 17 different scripts. "Surprise me," Lyra said with another smile. "I trust your judgment." David returned a few minutes later with 2 cups of Terran blend coffee and a small plate of butter cookies. He'd spent nearly all his remaining credits, but something about Lyra's earlier sadness made the expense feel worthwhile. "Terran blend," he explained as he set the cup in front of her. "It's from Earth, my home planet, mild but with a complex flavor profile." Lyra lifted the cup with both hands and inhaled deeply, closing her eyes as if memorizing the scent. "It smells like growing things," she said softly, "like rain on fertile soil." David blinked in surprise. Most aliens described Earth foods as either too bland or overwhelmingly organic. "You know about Earth agriculture?" he asked. "I know about many things," Lyra replied cryptically, taking a careful sip. "This is excellent, thank you." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the station's diverse population flow past their table. David found himself studying Lyra's profile, noting the way her luminescent pattern seemed to pulse in rhythm with her breathing. "Do you come here often?" David asked, then immediately felt foolish for using such a cliché conversation. Starter Lyra's lips curved upward, suggesting she caught the awkwardness too. "Not often enough to make friends," she said. "And you? Are you stationed here permanently?" "For now," David said. "I'm a translator, working freelance mostly, trying to build up a client base." "Translation," Lyra mused. "The art of finding meaning across the void between minds." Her phrasing struck David as unusually poetic. Most beings thought of translation as a simple technical skill, converting words from one language to another. "Exactly," he said with growing enthusiasm. "It's not just about vocabulary. It's about understanding how different species think, what concepts matter to them, how they organize reality in their..." Lyra leaned forward slightly, her violet eyes brightening with interest. "And human, how do they organize reality?" David considered the question seriously. "We're pattern seekers," he said finally. "We look for connections between things, stories that explain why events happen the way they do, relationships between cause and effect." "Even when no pattern exists?" Lyra asked. "Especially then," David laughed. "Humans would rather believe in a wrong pattern than accept that something is random." "Interesting," Lyra murmured, taking another sip of coffee. "And what pattern do you see in this moment? A human buying coffee for a stranger?" David felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Honestly, you looked lonely, and I know what that feels like." Lyra set down her cup and regarded him with an expression he couldn't read. "Loneliness," she repeated, as if testing the word. "Yes, I suppose that describes it accurately." "This place can be overwhelming," David said, gesturing toward the bustling corridor. "So many different species, all focused on their own business, no one really connecting." "Connection is rare," Lyra agreed. "Most interactions are transactional, beings seeking something from each other rather than simply enjoying each other's company." "Like right now?" David asked with a grin. Lyra's laugh was like wind chimes, musical and unexpected. "Perhaps," she said, "though I suspect your motives are more genuine than most." They finished their coffee while discussing everything from interspecies communication, theory to the relative merits of different planetary cuisines. David found Lyra surprisingly knowledgeable about topics ranging from quantum mechanics to ancient Earth literature. When she finally stood to leave, David felt a pang of disappointment. "Thank you, David Martinez," she said, and he realized he'd never told her his last name. "Will I see you again?" he asked. Perhaps too eagerly, Lyra paused, studying his face with those penetrating violet eyes. "Perhaps," she said softly, "the universe has a way of bringing certain people together." She walked away without looking back, her luminescent patterns pulsing gently as she disappeared into the crowd. David sat at the empty table for a long time afterward, staring at her cup and wondering if he'd imagined the entire encounter, but the lingering scent of something like starlight and distant oceans told him it had been very real indeed. David's communicator chimed just as he finished another rejection letter, this one from a Betazoid trading company claiming his work lacked emotional authenticity. The message header showed an official government seal he didn't recognize, geometric patterns that seemed to shift and pulse even on his small screen. "Mr. Martinez." The message began in perfect standard Galactic. "You have been selected for a specialized translation contract, Literature and Philosophy Division. Compensation will be substantial. Please confirm your availability for an initial meeting tomorrow at 1500 hours. Orbital Restaurant Cosmos, Level 47. David read the message 3 times. Certain it was some kind of mistake, he'd been scraping together barely enough credits to keep his tiny station apartment, surviving on instant noodles and recycled air, and now someone was offering him what sounded like serious money. The sender identification showed only Private Client, Altarian Cultural Exchange. Altarian. David had heard whispers about the Altarian Confederacy, supposedly one of the most advanced and wealthy civilizations in the known galaxy, but he'd never encountered one of their citizens personally. He sent back a confirmation message, trying not to sound too desperate despite his excitement. The next day, David borrowed a decent shirt from his neighbor and made his way to level 47, a part of the station he'd never visited before. The orbital restaurant Cosmos occupied an entire section of the upper levels, with transparent aluminum walls offering a stunning view of the nebula surrounding the station. David had never seen anything so elegant. Crystalline tables floating without visible support, soft music that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, and servers who moved like dancers between the scattered diners. He gave his name to the host, a tall being with blue skin and 4 arms, who gestured toward a private alcove near the observation windows. David's heart nearly stopped when he saw who was waiting for him. Lyra sat at the curved table, but this version of Lyra bore little resemblance to the lonely woman he'd met at the coffee shop. Her luminescent patterns now pulsed with confident authority, and she wore what was clearly expensive attire, a flowing garment that seemed to be woven from liquid starlight. Her posture was different too, straighter and more commanding, like someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Hello, David," she said as he approached, her musical voice carrying the same accent but with new undertones of power. "You're my client," David said, not quite making it a question. "I am," Lyra confirmed, gesturing for him to sit. "I hope you don't mind the deception. I needed to observe you in a natural setting before making this offer." David felt a mixture of confusion and hurt. So the coffee shop was what, some kind of test? Lyra's expression softened slightly. "Not a test exactly," she said. "More of an opportunity to see who you really are when you have nothing to gain." A server approached with a menu that projected holographic descriptions of each dish. David tried to focus on the food options but found himself stealing glances at Lyra, trying to reconcile this powerful figure with the sad woman who had seemed so grateful for simple kindness. "Order whatever you like," Lyra said. "This meal is included in your contract fee." David selected something called Andromedan pasta, mostly, because it was the only dish he recognized, while Lyra ordered a complex array of items with names he couldn't pronounce. "You said this was about literature and philosophy," David said once the server left. "Indeed," Lyra replied, her violet eyes brightening with interest. "I have a particular fascination with Terran cultural works, especially your classical literature and philosophical texts." She produced a small device that projected a list of titles into the air between them. David's eyes widened as he read names like Shakespeare, Plato, Confucius, Maya Angelou, and dozens of others. "You want me to translate all of these into Altarian?" he asked. "Not just translate," Lyra corrected. "I need someone who can capture the cultural context, the emotional resonance, the deeper meanings that pure linguistic conversion would miss." David leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed. "That's not just translation work," he said. "That's cultural interpretation, literary analysis, philosophical commentary." "Precisely why I chose you," Lyra said with a smile. Their food arrived, presented on plates that seemed to glow with inner light as they ate. Lyra explained more about the project. Altarian culture values logic and efficiency above most other virtues, she said. "But I believe we're missing something essential, the human capacity for finding meaning in struggle, beauty in imperfection, wisdom in contradiction. Why does that matter to you?" David asked. Lyra was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the nebula swirling beyond the windows. "Because pure logic has its limitations," she said finally. "My people have achieved incredible technological advancement, but we've perhaps lost touch with some fundamental truths about existence." They began working together the following week, meeting 3 times per week in various locations around the station. David would read passages aloud, explaining not just what the words meant, but why they mattered, how they reflected human experience and understanding. Lyra proved to be a brilliant student, asking insightful questions that forced David to examine familiar works from entirely new angles. When Hamlet says to be or not to be, he's not really talking about suicide, David explained during one session. He's wrestling with the fundamental question of whether existence itself is worth the pain it inevitably contains. And humans find this question compelling? Lyra asked. Essential, David replied. It's the foundation of how we think about meaning and purpose. Lyra nodded slowly, her luminescent patterns pulsing in what David had learned was a sign of deep concentration. Altarians would simply calculate the probability of positive versus negative experiences and make a logical decision, she said. But that misses the point, David said with growing excitement. The value isn't in the calculation, it's in the wrestling, the questioning itself, the refusal to accept easy answers. As the weeks passed, their professional relationship began to evolve into something more personal. Lyra would arrive early to their sessions, bringing exotic teas from different worlds. David started preparing more elaborate explanations, creating visual aids and examples to help her understand human, cultural concepts. They discovered they both enjoyed walking through the station's observation decks during off-peak hours, when the corridors were quieter and they could talk without interruption. Your species fascinates me, Lyra said during one of these walks. Humans seem to thrive on uncertainty, to find strength in vulnerability. Maybe because we had to, David replied. Earth was never an easy place to live. Natural disasters, predators, diseases, wars. We had to learn to find hope in hopeless situations. And now you carry that adaptability with you to the stars. Lyra mused. David found himself looking forward to their meetings with an anticipation that went far beyond professional interest. Lyra had a way of listening that made him feel like his thoughts truly mattered, like his insights into human nature were valuable rather than merely curious. She began sharing details about her own life, though always in vague terms. I have responsibilities back home, she said one evening as they watched ships dock at the station's lower levels. Expectations that sometimes feel overwhelming. What kind of responsibilities? David asked. Lyra's patterns dimmed slightly. The kind that leave little room for personal choice, she said cryptically. David sensed there was much more to her story but respected her privacy. During their study of romantic poetry, something shifted. Between them, David was reading aloud from Pablo Neruda when he noticed Lyra watching his face rather than following the text. The way you interpret these words, she said softly, it's like you're translating not just language but emotion itself. Their eyes met across the table, and David felt a jolt of connection that had nothing to do with literature or translation. Poetry is meant to be felt, not just understood, he said, his voice rougher than intended. Lyra leaned forward slightly, her luminescent patterns now pulsing with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. Show me, she whispered. David set down the book and moved around the table to sit beside her. He read the poem again, this time watching her face as the words washed over them both. When he finished, Lyra reached out and touched his hand. Her skin was warm and vibrating with that subtle energy he remembered from their first meeting. I think I'm beginning to understand, she said, but David suspected she wasn't talking about poetry anymore. They sat in silence for several minutes, hands intertwined, watching the stars wheel slowly past the observation window. David knew something fundamental had changed between them, but he also sensed that Lyra was holding back, wrestling with secrets she couldn't or wouldn't share. When she finally pulled her hand away and announced she needed to leave, David felt a profound sense of loss. Will I see you tomorrow? He asked. Lyra paused at the door, her expression unreadable. Yes, she said. But David, please understand that my situation is complicated in ways I cannot explain yet. After she left, David remained at the table for a long time, staring at his own reflection in the window and wondering what forces in Lyra's life could possibly be more powerful than what was growing between them. The sound of rain against the observation deck's reinforced windows created a gentle rhythm that seemed to match Lyra's breathing as she lay beside David on the small couch in his apartment. They had been reading together from a collection of Earth folk tales, but the book now lay forgotten on the floor. Tell me about loneliness on your world, David said softly, tracing one of the luminescent patterns on her arm with his fingertip. Lyra's skin pulsed brighter at his touch. A response he'd learned indicated either strong emotion or deep thought. Altarians don't typically discuss such concepts, she said, her voice carrying that musical quality that always made him think of wind through crystal formations. We're raised to value independent self-sufficiency, logical decision-making. But you feel lonely anyway, David observed. I have felt isolated for most of my life, Lyra admitted, turning to face him more fully. My position, my responsibilities, they require me to maintain distance from others. David wanted to ask more about these mysterious responsibilities, but he'd learned to let Lyra share information at her own pace. What's your family like? He asked instead. Lyra's patterns dimmed noticeably. Complicated, she said after a pause. Altarian families are not like human families. They're more like business partnerships, alliances formed for mutual benefit rather than affection. That sounds awful. It's efficient, Lyra said, but her tone suggested she didn't find this particularly comforting. Emotions are considered potential weaknesses, sources of poor judgment, and irrational behavior. David propped himself up on one elbow to look down at her. And what do you think? I used to believe they were right, Lyra said, reaching up to touch his face. Logic and reason seemed like the most reliable guides for decision-making. Used to? Lyra's smile held a sadness that made David's chest tighten. You've shown me there's wisdom in feeling, strength in vulnerability, logic in apparent contradictions. Their relationship had deepened gradually over the past month. What began as extended work sessions had evolved into long conversations about everything from quantum mechanics to the meaning of art. David found himself telling Lyra things he'd never shared with anyone. His childhood fears, his dreams of becoming more than just a translator, his sometimes crushing sense of inadequacy in a universe full of beings more advanced than humans. In return, Lyra had begun opening up about her own struggles, though always in carefully guarded terms. Sometimes I wonder what my life would be like if I could simply choose my own path, she said, during one of their evening walks through the station's quieter sections. What would you choose? David asked. Something meaningful, she replied without hesitation. Something that helps bridge understanding between species rather than merely advancing Altarian interests. David had never heard her speak so directly about her work before. You make it sound like your current job is something you don't believe in. Lyra stopped walking and turned toward the large window overlooking the nebula. My current responsibilities require me to think primarily about what benefits my people, she said carefully. But increasingly I find myself wondering about what benefits everyone. They had kissed for the first time 2 weeks earlier, after a particularly intense discussion about human concepts of sacrifice and love. David had been explaining the story of Romeo and Juliet when Lyra interrupted him. The appeal is not that they die for love, she said with sudden insight. It's that they choose love, despite knowing it will destroy them. Exactly, David said, struck by her understanding. Humans find beauty in doomed choices, wisdom in apparent foolishness, and you think that's wrong. I think it's the most rational thing I've ever heard, Lyra said. And then she kissed him. Her lips were softer than he'd expected, and her skin carried that same subtle vibration he'd noticed during their first handshake when they broke apart. Both were breathing heavily. I should not have done that, Lyra whispered. But she didn't move away. Why? David asked. Because it complicates everything. Good, David said, pulling her closer. Complicated is more interesting than simple. Now, lying together in his small apartment with the artificial rain pattering against the windows, David felt a contentment he'd never experienced before. Lyra had spent the night several times over the past weeks, and each time David discovered new things about her. Her skin glowed brighter when she was happy and dimmed when she was troubled. She had an incredibly detailed knowledge of dozens of star systems, but had apparently never experienced simple pleasures, like sleeping late or eating breakfast in bed. What happens when this project is finished? David asked, breaking their comfortable silence. Lyra's patterns immediately grew darker. I will have to return to Altaria Prime, she said. And then what? And then I will resume my duties, she said in a tone that suggested the topic was closed. David recognized the wall coming down between them. the same barrier that appeared whenever their conversations approached certain subjects. "Lyra," he said, gently, "whatever's waiting for you back home. Is it really so terrible that you can't even talk about it?" She sat up abruptly, wrapping her arms around her knees. "You don't understand the pressures I face," she said. "The expectations, the consequences of failing to meet them." "Then help me understand." Lyra looked at him with an expression of such profound sadness that David felt his heart breaking. "Some burdens cannot be shared," she said. "Some choices affect more than just the person making them." David wanted to argue, to insist that whatever she was facing, they could handle it together. But something in her voice, a finality that seemed absolute, made him hold back. "I care about you," he said instead. "I know," Lyra replied, and her patterns pulsed with what David had learned indicated deep affection. "That's what makes this so difficult." They spent the rest of the night talking about safer subjects: David's childhood on Earth, Lyra's fascination with human concepts of art and beauty, their shared love of the quiet hours when the station's crowds thinned out. But underneath the casual conversation, David could sense a tension growing in Lyra, as if she were preparing for something unpleasant. The next morning, David woke to find Lyra standing by the window, fully dressed and staring out at the nebula with an expression of grim determination. "You're leaving," David said, though he wasn't sure how he knew. "Not immediately," Lyra said without turning around. "But soon. My people are sending a ship for me." "How soon?" 3 days. David felt like the artificial gravity had suddenly failed. 3 days? That's it? After everything we've shared, everything between us? Lyra finally turned to face him, and David could see she'd been crying, something he hadn't known Altarians could do. "You think this is easy for me?" she asked, her voice breaking slightly. "You think I want to walk away from the first genuine happiness I've ever known?" "Then don't," David said desperately. "Stay. Find another way." "There is no other way," Lyra said with such conviction that David knew she'd already considered every possible alternative. "My duties, my obligations, they're not just professional commitments, David. They're the foundation of my entire civilization." David wanted to ask what responsibilities could possibly be so important, what duties could outweigh personal happiness. But looking at Lyra's face, seeing the anguish there, he realized that pushing for answers would only cause her more pain. "What do we do with these 3 days?" he asked instead. Lyra's expression softened slightly. "We continue as we have been," she said. "We finish the translation project, we spend time together, and we try to make peace with the fact that some things cannot be changed." David nodded, though. Every part of him wanted to rebel against the idea of simply accepting their separation. "And after you leave?" he asked. "After I leave, you will have enough credits from this project to establish yourself as a premier cultural interpreter," Lyra said. "You'll be able to build the career you've dreamed of." "That's not what I meant." Lyra approached the bed and took his hand. "I know," she said softly, "but it's the only future I can offer you." They spent those final 3 days in a kind of suspended reality, both pretending that Lyra's departure wasn't rapidly approaching. David threw himself into completing the translation work with obsessive attention to detail. Lyra seemed to memorize every moment they spent together, as if she were trying to store up enough happiness to last the rest of her life on their last night together. They sat on David's small balcony watching ships arrive and depart from the docking bays below. "Will you ever be able to tell me the truth?" David asked. "About who you really are? What you're really going back to?" Lyra was quiet for so long that David thought she might not answer. "Perhaps someday," she said finally, "if circumstances change." "What would have to change?" Lyra stood and moved to the railing, her luminescent patterns pulsing slowly in the darkness. "Everything," she whispered. David joined her at the railing, wrapping his arms around her from behind. They stood like that until dawn, holding each other and watching the universe spin around them, both knowing that in a few hours everything they'd built together would become nothing more than memory. David's apartment door chimed at exactly 800 hours, But instead of Lyra's familiar musical voice, he heard multiple sets of footsteps and the distinct hum of advanced scanning equipment. He opened the door to find 4 beings in sleek silver uniforms, bearing insignia that seemed to shift and change as he looked at them. Behind them stood Lyra, but this version of her bore no resemblance to the woman who had shared his bed just hours before. She wore a flowing robe that appeared to be woven from liquid starlight itself, and her luminescent patterns now pulsed with an authority so profound that David instinctively took a step backward. David Martinez, one of the uniformed beings, said in a voice like grinding metal, "You will accompany us for debriefing regarding your association with Primary Executive Lyra Stellaris." Primary Executive. The title hit David like a physical blow. Stellaris. He repeated numbly, recognizing the name from countless news feeds and financial reports. Stellaris Industries controlled shipping lanes, mining operations, and technological patents across half the known galaxy. Their annual revenue exceeded the total economic output of most star systems. "Please don't make this more difficult than necessary," Lyra said, though her eyes pleaded with him to understand, something she couldn't voice aloud. David found himself escorted through corridors of the station he'd never seen before, past security checkpoints that required genetic scans and neural pattern verification. They entered a conference room with walls made of some transparent material that offered a panoramic view of space. Lyra dismissed her security detail with a gesture, leaving them alone. "You're her," David said when the door sealed behind the guards. "You're actually Lyra Stellaris." "I am," Lyra confirmed, her voice carrying tones of authority that seemed to resonate in the walls themselves. "The wealthiest individual in known space." "Among the top 3, yes." David sank into one of the floating chairs, trying to process the magnitude of the deception. Everything was a lie. "No," Lyra said firmly, moving to face him across the conference table. "My feelings for you were never false. My identity was hidden, but my emotions were completely genuine." "How can I believe anything you say?" David asked, anger finally breaking through his shock. "You've been lying to me from the moment we met." Lyra's patterns dimmed with what David now recognized as shame. "I couldn't tell you the truth," she said. "Not until I was certain you could be trusted." "Trusted with what?" Lyra activated a holographic display that filled the air between them with complex charts and genetic diagrams. "Altarian succession law," she began, "dictates that control of major family enterprises must pass to the next generation within specific timeframes." David stared at the floating data, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "I have until the end of this solar cycle to produce an heir," Lyra continued, "or forfeit control of Stellaris Industries to my cousin Kale and his faction." The pieces began falling into place in David's mind, each realization more crushing than the last. So this whole thing, the translation project, the relationship, it was all about finding someone to father your child. "It began that way," Lyra admitted. "But David, you must understand. I never expected to feel anything genuine for you." "Feel anything?" David laughed bitterly. "You're worth more than most planetary governments. What could you possibly feel for someone like me?" Lyra leaned forward, her luminescent patterns now pulsing rapidly with distress. "You saw me as a person," she said. "Not as a prize to be won or a resource to be exploited. For the first time in my life, someone valued my thoughts and opinions rather than my wealth and connections." David wanted to dismiss her words as manipulation, but the anguish in her voice seemed too raw to be fabricated. "Why me specifically?" he asked. "There must be thousands of beings more suitable for whatever you need." Lyra manipulated the holographic display, showing genetic compatibility charts and biological analysis data. "Altarian physiology is compatible with only a few species," she explained. "And among those, humans show the highest probability of producing viable hybrid offspring." "Viable hybrids," David repeated flatly. "That's what you need me for." "It's more complex than that," Lyra said. "The heir must be capable of understanding both Altarian logic and emotional intelligence. My research suggested that human adaptability and cultural empathy, combined with Altarian analytical capabilities, would produce an ideal leader, David. studied the genetic projections floating before him, trying to absorb the scientific implications, and if you don't produce this heir, Lyra's expression grew darker. Kale Stellaris takes control of the family assets, she said. He represents the old faction, those who believe in Altarian supremacy, resource extraction without regard for environmental impact, and economic policies that treat other species as subordinate. The holographic display shifted to show industrial operations on dozens of worlds. David saw strip mining operations that had turned entire continents into wasteland, manufacturing facilities that pumped toxic chemicals into planetary atmospheres, and trade agreements that clearly favored Altarian interests at the expense of other civilizations. Under Kale's leadership, Stellaris Industries would abandon all environmental protections and interspecies cooperation initiatives, Lyra continued. Billions of beings across the galaxy would suffer. David felt overwhelmed by the scope of what she was describing. So you're asking me to help you save the galaxy? I'm asking you to help me save the future, Lyra said softly. But David, I want you to know that even if you refuse, I will never regret our time together. David stood and walked to the transparent wall, staring out at the nebula that had provided the backdrop for so many of their intimate conversations. How long have you been planning this? He asked. The search for a suitable genetic partner began 2 years ago, Lyra admitted, but the decision to approach you specifically was made only after I observed your character during our first meeting. The coffee shop wasn't an accident. No, Lyra said. I had been monitoring potential candidates at the station, but when you offered to buy me a drink, despite clearly having limited resources, I knew you possessed the qualities I was looking for. David turned back to face her, compassion. And stupidity, empathy, and genuine altruism, Lyra corrected. The willingness to help someone without expecting anything in return. The room fell silent except for the subtle hum of the station's life support systems. David found himself thinking about all their conversations, all the moments that had seemed so spontaneous and natural. How much of it was real? He asked. All of it, Lyra said with conviction. My growing feelings for you, my fascination with human culture, the way you made me question everything I believed about the value of logic over emotion. None of that was planned or fabricated. But you would have left anyway, David pointed out. If your people hadn't found out about us, Lyra's patterns dimmed with sadness. I thought I could complete the project and walk away, she said. I believed I could maintain emotional distance while still achieving my biological goals, and now I realize that was the most illogical plan I've ever conceived, Lyra said with a bitter laugh. I underestimated the power of genuine connection. David returned to his chair, studying Lyra's face for any sign of deception. What exactly are you proposing? Help me conceive an heir, Lyra said. In return, I will ensure that you never want for anything. Wealth, status, the resources to build any career you desire. And emotionally, David asked, what happens between us? Lyra's luminescent patterns pulsed with uncertainty. I don't know, she admitted. I've never been in this situation before. David felt a hollow sensation in his chest. So I become your breeding partner and live the rest of my life wondering if you actually care about me or just need me for your succession plans. David, Lyra said desperately, what I feel for you has nothing to do with succession law or genetic compatibility. You've become essential to my happiness in ways I never thought possible. But you'd still be using me. We would be using each other, Lyra corrected. You would gain security and opportunity. I would gain the chance to protect billions of beings from my cousin's destructive policies. David stared at the genetic chart still floating in the air between them. How much time do I have to decide? The solar cycle ends in 6 standard months, Lyra said. But David, there are other factors you need to consider. She manipulated the display again, showing news feeds and financial reports. Word of our relationship has already begun spreading. Through certain circles, she said. Kale's supporters are calling you a fortune hunter, claiming you seduced me for personal gain. David felt his stomach drop. They're targeting me? They're targeting both of us, Lyra said grimly. But yes, as a human with limited resources who suddenly gained access to one of the galaxy's most powerful individuals, you represent a convenient narrative for them. The holographic display showed images of David that had clearly been taken without his knowledge, entering and leaving Lyra's hotel, walking with her through the station's corridors, sitting together in restaurants. How long before this becomes public? David asked. It may already be too late to contain, Lyra admitted, which means your life is about to become very complicated regardless of what you decide. David realized that simply walking away was no longer an option. Whether he helped Lyra or not, he was now part of a story that would follow him for the rest of his life. I need time to think, he said. Of course, Lyra replied, but David, please understand that I never intended for any of this to hurt you. As David prepared to leave the conference room, one more question occurred to him. If I say yes, he asked, what happens to us and to whatever this relationship really is? Lyra's expression filled with longing and uncertainty. I honestly don't know, she said, but I hope we have the chance to find out. David's communicator buzzed with the 15th threatening message of the day as he sat in his apartment, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The messages ranged from crude insults about human greed to sophisticated legal warnings about interfering with Altarian family succession. Someone had leaked his personal information to the galactic news networks, and now his image appeared alongside headlines like Human Fortune Hunter Seduces Alien Heiress and Stellaris Succession Crisis Deepens. A soft chime indicated someone at his door. David opened it to find Lyra, flanked by 2 security guards, but her usual regal bearing was replaced by obvious exhaustion. Her luminescent patterns were dim and irregular, pulsing with what David had learned indicated severe stress. May I come in? She asked. David stepped aside, noting how the security guards positioned themselves to scan the corridor in both directions. Bad day? He asked as Lyra settled onto his small couch. Kale's faction has escalated their campaign, she said. They're claiming that your involvement in succession proceedings violates several interspecies treaties. Do they have a legal case? They might, Lyra admitted. Altarian law was written before we had extensive contact with other species. There are ambiguities that could be exploited. David activated his apartment's privacy shield and poured himself fresh coffee. What does that mean for your timeline? If they can prove legal violations, they could petition the Altarian High Council to declare me unfit for succession immediately, Lyra explained. Instead of 6 months, I might have 6 weeks. David set down his cup harder than intended. 6 weeks to conceive, carry, and deliver a child? That's biologically impossible. Not deliver, Lyra corrected. Altarian law only requires proof of viable conception. The heir must be confirmed to exist, not born. The distinction offered little comfort to David. Still not much time for a decision of this magnitude. Lyra's patterns pulsed with frustration. I know how unfair this is to you, she said, being forced to choose between helping me and maintaining your privacy and safety. It's not just about me anymore, David replied, showing her his communicator's message log. Look at this. Lyra scrolled through the threats and harassment, her expression growing darker with each message. I'll have security investigate these senders, she said. That's not the point, David said. The point is that refusing to help you doesn't make any of this go away. I'm already part of this story whether I want to be or not. David had spent the past 3 days researching Altarian succession law and Stellaris Industries' business practices. What he'd discovered made the choice even more complex. I looked into your cousin's previous ventures, he said. Lyra's attention sharpened. And? He was involved in the Kepler mining disaster that poisoned 3 star systems, the labor disputes on Centauri colonies that resulted in hundreds of deaths, and the trade embargo that caused famine on the outer rim worlds. Kale believes in profit maximization regardless of external costs, Lyra said quietly. If he takes control of Stellaris Industries, how many beings will suffer? Conservative estimates suggest billions, Lyra replied. His faction wants to abandon all environmental regulations, eliminate worker protection standards, and restructure trade agreements to maximize Altarian advantages. David walked to his small window looking out at the diverse crowd of beings moving through the station's corridors. "I keep thinking about all the species represented out there," he said. "The families, the children, the entire civilizations that could be affected by this decision. The weight of that responsibility should not fall on your shoulders," Lyra said. "But it already has," David replied. "The moment you chose me as a potential partner, you made me responsible for those consequences." Lyra stood and joined him at the window. "I never intended to burden you with the fate of the galaxy." "Maybe not," David said. "But that's what happened." They stood in silence for several minutes, watching ships arrive and depart from the docking bays below. "Can I ask you something personal?" David said finally. "Of course. If there were no succession laws, no business empire, no political consequences, what would you want?" Lyra's patterns brightened slightly. "I would want to continue what we started," she said, "exploring human culture, learning from your perspectives, building something genuine between us. And children?" "Someday, perhaps," Lyra said, "but as a choice made from love rather than legal obligation." David felt his chest tighten with emotion. "That's what makes this so difficult," he said. "I care about you too, more than I thought possible." "Then why do you hesitate?" David turned to face her fully. "Because I need to know that if I agree to this, it's for the right reasons," he said. "Not because I'm flattered by the attention of someone wealthy and powerful, not because I'm afraid of the consequences of refusing, but because it's genuinely the right thing to do." Lyra nodded slowly. "And how do you determine that?" David had been wrestling with this question for days. "I keep coming back to something you said about humans finding wisdom in apparent contradictions," he said. "Maybe the contradiction here is that doing something primarily for others might be the most selfish thing I've ever considered." "How so?" "Because saying yes means I get to stay connected to you," David explained. "It means I become part of something larger than myself, something that could genuinely improve life for billions of beings. And saying no? Saying no means I preserve my dignity and independence while potentially condemning countless innocent beings to suffer under your cousin's policies." Lyra's luminescent patterns pulsed with understanding. "You're trying to find a choice that serves both your personal ethics and the greater good." "Exactly," David said. "And I'm not sure such a choice exists." Lyra moved closer, taking his hands in hers. "David," she said softly, "I want you to know that whatever you decide, I will respect your choice completely, even if it means losing everything you've worked for." "Even then," Lyra confirmed, "because forcing you into this would make me no better than the forces I'm trying to oppose." David felt a profound shift in his understanding of the situation. "You're giving me genuine choice even though you desperately need my cooperation." "I have to," Lyra said, "because anything else would contradict everything I believe about respecting individual autonomy." David realized this was perhaps the most important test of Lyra's character he could have asked for. "What if I said yes but insisted on conditions?" "What kind of conditions?" David had been thinking about this possibility for days. "Legal protections for me and any potential children," he said. "Guarantees about my role in raising the heir, provisions for maintaining my own career and identity." "All reasonable requests," Lyra said. "What else?" "A formal commitment that Stellaris Industries will maintain its current environmental and labor policies regardless of succession outcomes." Lyra's eyes widened slightly. "That would require unprecedented legal documentation," she said. "Corporate charters that supersede traditional Altarian authority structures." "Is it possible?" "Theoretically, yes," Lyra said, "but it would be extraordinarily complex and expensive to implement." David felt a spark of hope. "But if we could make it work, it would protect those billions of beings regardless of what happens between us personally." "You're thinking like a strategist," Lyra observed with approval. "I'm thinking like someone who doesn't want this choice to be about choosing between personal happiness and moral responsibility." Lyra's patterns now pulsed with excitement. "You're proposing a solution that serves multiple objectives simultaneously. Exactly, David said. Help you meet succession requirements while building legal protections that outlast any individual leader. It would take weeks to draft such agreements, Lyra warned. Then we better start soon, David replied. Lyra stared at him with an expression of wonder. Are you saying yes? David took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision settle on his shoulders. I'm saying yes to helping you, he said, but I'm also saying yes to building something that's bigger than either of us individually. Lyra's luminescent patterns blazed with joy and relief. You understand the risks involved? I understand that some risks are worth taking, David replied, especially when the alternative is letting fear make your decisions for you. Lyra moved into his arms, and David felt that same electric connection that had marked their first kiss. Thank you, she whispered against his ear. Don't thank me yet, David said. We still have to figure out how to make this work without destroying each other in the process. Together, Lyra said firmly. Together, David agreed, hoping they were strong enough to handle whatever came next. The medical scanner's soft hum filled the private clinic as Dr. Vale, a renowned specialist in interspecies reproduction, reviewed the holographic displays with obvious satisfaction. Congratulations, she announced, her 4 eyes focusing independently on David and Lyra. The conception is confirmed viable. All genetic markers indicate optimal hybrid development. David felt Lyra's hand tighten in his as relief flooded through both of them. After 6 weeks of legal negotiations, corporate restructuring, and constant harassment from Kale's supporters, they had finally achieved their primary objective. When will you file the succession documentation? David asked. Immediately, Lyra replied, her luminescent patterns pulsing. With triumph. By law, Kale has 48 hours to contest the filing. Will he? Certainly, Lyra said, but our legal team believes his challenges will fail. We've covered every possible objection. Dr. Vale continued her examination, documenting the genetic scans that would serve as legal proof of the heir's existence. The AM hybrid shows remarkable compatibility, she noted. Enhanced cognitive capacity from the Altarian lineage combined with increased emotional intelligence and adaptability from the human contribution. David had grown accustomed to being discussed as a genetic contributor rather than a father, but hearing it still felt strange. What can we expect developmentally? Lyra asked. Accelerated neural development during the first trimester, Dr. Vale explained. The child will likely demonstrate both logical reasoning and creative problem-solving capabilities well beyond typical ranges for either species. After the appointment, David and Lyra returned to their new shared quarters in the station's executive section. The space was significantly larger than David's previous apartment, with panoramic windows and furnishings that adjusted automatically to their preferences. Hard to believe we actually pulled this off, David said, settling onto the adaptive couch that immediately molded itself to his body. The conception was the easy part, Lyra replied. Now we have to navigate the next 18 years of raising a child who will inherit one of the galaxy's largest business empires. David had been thinking about this challenge constantly. We need to make sure they understand both worlds, he said. Altarian logic and efficiency, but also human creativity and empathy. Agreed, Lyra said. But David, I want you to know that regardless of what happens with Stellaris Industries, I intend for us to raise this child together as equal parents. The legal documents they'd spent weeks drafting guaranteed David's parental rights, but hearing Lyra confirm her commitment meant more than any contract. What about us? David asked. The relationship between us personally? Lyra's patterns dimmed slightly with uncertainty. I hope we can build something real, she said. Something based on choice rather than necessity. We're already building it, David pointed out. Every day we work together. Every decision we make, as partners rather than as business associates. Over the following months, their relationship evolved in ways neither had anticipated. What began as a strategic alliance gradually transformed into genuine partnership as they learned to trust each other with increasingly personal vulnerabilities. Lyra shared stories of her isolated childhood, raised by tutors and artificial intelligences while her parents focused on expanding the family business empire. David talked about growing up in a working-class family on Earth, where money was always tight, but emotional support was abundant. "Your parents sound wonderful," Lyra said during one of their evening conversations. "They are," David replied. "I think you'd like them. They judge people by their character rather than their achievements." "I've never had that kind of acceptance," Lyra admitted. "You have it now," David said softly. As Stellaris Industries underwent restructuring under the new legal frameworks they'd established, David found himself taking on an increasingly important role. His background in cultural interpretation proved invaluable for developing policies that respected the diverse needs of different species across their business operations. The Centaurian trade representatives are confused by our new labor protection standards, David reported during one of their weekly strategy meetings. "Because they're used to being exploited?" Lyra asked. "Because they don't understand why anyone would voluntarily limit profit margins to ensure worker safety," David explained. "Their previous contracts with other corporations included no such protections." "How did you handle it?" "I explained that sustainable business practices create more long-term value than short-term profit maximization," David said. "Once they understood that we were making a strategic choice rather than an emotional one, they became much more receptive." Lyra's patterns pulsed with admiration. "You're translating not just language but entire conceptual frameworks." "That's exactly what it is," David agreed. "And it's exactly what our child will need to learn how to do." Their child, who they had decided to name Alex, a name that worked in both human and Altarian pronunciation, was developing ahead of all medical projections. The neural scans show remarkable integration between logical and intuitive processing centers, Dr. Vale reported during a routine examination. "This child will likely be capable of understanding complex emotional dynamics while maintaining analytical objectivity. The perfect combination for leadership in a diverse galaxy," Lyra observed, "or for bridging understanding between species that have never trusted each other," David added. When Alex was born, David experienced a profound shift in his understanding of responsibility and love, holding his child for the first time. A being whose skin carried faint luminescent patterns, but whose eyes held unmistakably human curiosity. David realized that every choice he'd made had led to this moment. "Look at those eyes," Lyra whispered, her own luminescent patterns glowing brighter than David had ever seen them. "Already trying to understand everything. Definitely takes after both parents," David said with a laugh as Alex grew. It became clear that their genetic heritage offered advantages neither parent had anticipated. The child demonstrated an intuitive understanding of emotional nuance that impressed Altarian psychologists while maintaining the logical reasoning capabilities that allowed them to grasp complex mathematical concepts by age 3. "Alex is going to change how our species interact," Lyra said as they watched their 5-year-old child mediating a dispute between their Altarian tutors and human babysitters. "Look how naturally they find common ground between different perspectives." "Maybe that's what the galaxy needs," David replied. "Leaders who can understand multiple viewpoints simultaneously." "Perhaps the universe knew what it was doing when it brought us together," Lyra mused. David looked at his partner, no longer just the mysterious woman from the coffee shop or the powerful executive who had needed his help, but someone who had become essential to his happiness in ways he couldn't have imagined. "I love you," he said, realizing it was the first time he'd spoken those words without any reservations or complications attached. "I love you too," Lyra replied, her patterns pulsing with complete contentment. "All of this, the business, the politics, the responsibilities, none of it would mean anything without you and Alex." Years later, as David stood in the observation deck of the new Stellaris Industries headquarters, watching ships from dozens of species arrive for the quarterly interspecies trade summit, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed. Alex, now 15 and serving as a junior cultural liaison, was down in the conference rooms helping resolve a complicated dispute between crystal-based silicon life forms and carbon-based humanoids. The solution they had proposed, a hybrid communication protocol that respected both species fundamentally. Different approaches to information processing had impressed negotiators from across the galaxy. Proud of our kid? Lyra asked, joining David at the observation window. Incredibly proud, David replied. And not just because of their diplomatic skills. Look how naturally they treat every being as deserving of respect and understanding. That's the human influence, Lyra said with a smile, and the analytical framework that lets them find practical solutions to seemingly impossible problems is pure Altarian, David countered. The best of both worlds, Lyra agreed. David put his arm around Lyra, marveling at how natural the gesture had become. Do you ever think about that first day in the coffee shop? He asked. Often, Lyra replied. I think about how lonely I was, how isolated I felt despite being surrounded by wealth and power. And now? Now I understand that real wealth isn't measured in credits or corporate assets, Lyra said. It's measured in connections, in having people who value you for who you are rather than what you can provide. Even if what you can provide happens to be control over one of the galaxy's largest business empires? David teased. Especially then. Lyra laughed. They watched Alex emerge from the conference building with a group of satisfied negotiators. David reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had brought them to this moment, a simple act of kindness, buying coffee for a lonely stranger, had rippled outward to reshape interspecies relations across entire star systems. Alex looked up at the observation deck and waved, their luminescent patterns pulsing with the joy that came from successful problem-solving. You know what the best part is? David said. What's that? Alex will grow up in a galaxy where cooperation between species is normal rather than exceptional, David said. They'll never know a time when beings automatically assumed the worst about each other. That's the real legacy, Lyra agreed. Not the business empire or the political influence, but the cultural changes we've helped create. David smiled as he watched their child animatedly explaining something to a group of trade representatives who were listening with obvious respect and interest. Not bad for a simple translator and a lonely billionaire, he said. Not bad at all, Lyra replied, her patterns glowing with contentment. In the distance, ships from worlds across the galaxy continued their steady stream of arrivals, bringing beings together for commerce, diplomacy, and cultural exchange, in ways that would have been impossible just a generation earlier. And at the center of it all was Alex, living proof that love could indeed transcend the boundaries between worlds, species, and understanding itself.